It was still dark over the Pacific. The humid air hung heavy above a small Japanese airbase on the island of Saipan, June 1944. Engines coughed to life one by one, propellers slicing the silence into fragments of noise. Ground crews moved quickly, checking fuel lines, loading bombs, shouting final words to pilots who would soon vanish into the clouds. Inside the cockpits, the men believed they held the element of surprise. Their orders were clear: strike the advancing American fleet before dawn, hit their carriers before the sun revealed their silhouettes. Every pilot trusted Japan's decades-old advantage: speed, stealth, and timing. But as the first Zero fighters rolled onto the runway, unseen eyes were already watching. Hundreds of miles away on American ships and island outposts, radar screens glowed faintly in the dark. Lines of static formed arcs, moving dots marking aircraft that hadn't even left the ground. Operators calmly relayed coordinates. Fighters scrambled before the Japanese wheels even lifted. By the time the pilots reached open sea, the Americans were waiting. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had become a struggle of endurance, a vast contest of distance, resources, and invisible intelligence. Japan's empire, once a roaring tide that had swept across Asia and the Pacific, was beginning to ebb. The Allies had learned. The element of surprise, once Japan's most fearsome weapon, was vanishing into the static of American radio waves. 2 years earlier, Japan had dominated the skies. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, its pilots had moved like phantoms, striking swiftly, disappearing into clouds before the enemy even knew they were coming. American commanders called it the Japanese way of war: deception, speed, and precision. The Zero fighter symbolized that philosophy: light, maneuverable, and deadly. But behind every Japanese victory was a dangerous assumption: that surprise was eternal. As the war dragged on, that illusion began to fracture. American science, and silent, patient, and tireless, was reshaping the battlefield. While Japan perfected its code of Bushido and its art of aerial combat, the United States poured its genius into the unseen realm of technology. It was no longer just about who could shoot first, and it was about who could see first. The Americans had begun constructing a vast network, a chain of listening posts, antennas and radar stations stretching from Pearl Harbor across island after island. Midway, Johnston, Guam, and beyond, these were not glamorous weapons. There were no heroic silhouettes, no polished steel, just towers, wires, and screens manned by young technicians who spent their nights watching glowing lines crawl across glass. Radar, radio detection and ranging, was the quiet revolution of modern warfare. Born in laboratories in the 1930s, it worked by sending invisible radio waves into the air and measuring the reflections that bounced back. It could see planes long before human eyes could. To those who understood it, radar was more than a machine, it was prophecy. But in Tokyo, many still doubted it. Japanese engineers knew of radar, of course. They had experimented with primitive sets even before the war. But the Imperial Navy had dismissed it as unreliable, especially at long ranges or over water. Pilots were taught that the best detection system was the human eye. Radar, they were told, was an indulgence for cautious nations, not for warriors. That belief would soon cost them dearly. By 1943, American and British scientists had refined radar into a lethal edge. New models like the SCR-270 and SCR-527 gave early warning of incoming raids from hundreds of miles away. On naval vessels, radar was being fused with anti-aircraft fire control systems, allowing gunners to lock onto targets they couldn't even see. What Japan viewed as a minor invention had become the heartbeat of Allied operations. Still, the Japanese pilots flew on, confident that their tactics of surprise and precision bombing would continue to work. They believed the Americans were slow to react, blinded by distance, dulled by machinery. The Pacific was vast, and they thought, wrongly, that no one could possibly track a formation the moment it left the ground. In late 1943 and early 1944, strange incidents began to unsettle that belief. Squadrons would take off for night raids, perfectly timed, carefully planned, only to find American defenses already awake, searchlights waiting, guns trained skyward. Pilots reported being intercepted at impossible distances, as if the enemy had read their flight plans. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Others whispered that the Americans had found a new kind of spy. What they didn't yet realize was that the spy was not a person. It was a pulse of energy moving through the air, silent, invisible, and unstoppable. By the time Japan began to suspect the truth, radar was already everywhere. On islands, aboard carriers, even on destroyers scanning the horizon. The U.S. Navy was learning to see through fog, through darkness, through the very illusion of surprise that Japan had built its empire upon. The next great air operation would prove this in the most devastating way imaginable. Radar's story in the Pacific was not born from chance, it was born from necessity. After the shock of Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States vowed never to be caught blind again. American scientists, engineers, and military planners accelerated every secret project that could detect, predict, or anticipate an enemy before the first shot was fired. The turning point came with the SCR-270 radar, a towering, truck-mounted system that could detect aircraft up to 150 miles away. It had ironically already spotted the Japanese planes approaching Pearl Harbor, but its warning had gone unheeded. By 1943, that mistake would not be repeated. The Americans had refined the technology, hardened the operators, and learned how to weave radar into the very fabric of command and control. Across the Pacific, new installations sprouted like iron trees. On islands such as Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and the Gilberts, radar dishes rotated ceaselessly, sweeping the skies while generators throbbed through the night. In underground bunkers and canvas command tents, radar operators, often barely out of high school, stared at the glowing green circles that would decide life and death. To the Japanese, this new kind of warfare was alien. Their intelligence services intercepted reports of American listening stations, but the concept seemed implausible. In the early 1940s, Japanese technology had its own radar experiments, sets like the Type II Mark I Model 1, but they were fragile, short-ranged, and plagued by interference. Engineers in Tokyo lacked the industrial materials and precision components that American factories could produce in endless quantities. Even when Japanese scientists began to understand what the Allies were doing, it was already too late to catch up. In 1944, the U.S. Navy took radar beyond defense, turning it into an offensive weapon. Carriers like the USS Enterprise and USS Lexington were equipped with advanced air search radar that guided interceptors directly to incoming squadrons. Destroyers patrolling in the night could pick out low-flying torpedo bombers before they were even visible to spotters. The Pacific's vast distances, once Japan's shield, had become its trap. The Japanese high command noticed a pattern they couldn't explain. Every time they planned a surprise raid, the enemy reacted too soon. Fighter patrols appeared at perfect intercept points. Anti-aircraft guns were manned before the first bomb fell. The most disciplined formations were being ambushed as if the Americans had read their minds. At first, suspicion fell on espionage. Maybe the Americans had broken their codes. Maybe local civilians had betrayed information. But even when new ciphers and communication protocols were introduced, the result was the same. The Americans always knew. Some Japanese pilots began reporting eerie experiences. They would take off under complete radio silence, fly over open ocean for hours, and suddenly spot distant flashes of tracer fire long before radar warning devices could even exist on their planes. Others described American night fighters emerging from darkness like ghosts, guided by something unseen. By the summer of 1944, the truth began to crystallize, slowly, reluctantly, and too late. Japanese intelligence had intercepted fragments of American reports, describing radar coverage nets and early warning coordination. Naval officers reading those documents struggled to comprehend the scale. The United States had not just installed a few radar sets, it had built an entire network, linking ships, islands, and aircraft into one synchronized detection grid. This invisible architecture gave the Americans something Japan no longer possessed: anticipation. They could predict flight paths, estimate altitudes, and deploy interceptors before the attackers even knew they had been found. Surprise, the cornerstone of Japanese aerial warfare, was dissolving before their eyes. Yet even as the evidence mounted, pride clouded judgment. Within Japan's military hierarchy, many officers still clung to the old code, the belief that courage and discipline would prevail over machines. They called radar a coward's weapon, a device for those too afraid to face the enemy directly. It was a fatal delusion. In June 1944, that delusion would meet its reckoning. During one of Japan's final large-scale air operations in the Marianas, the Americans would demonstrate just how deep their vision extended, seeing what could not be seen, and striking before the first Japanese propeller had even turned. The skies over the Pacific were about to change forever. The technological angle. The power of invisible sight radar was more than a tool. It was a revolution. To those who manned the dimly lit radar rooms scattered across the Pacific, it felt like touching the future. In an age when pilots trusted their eyes and instincts, radar replaced vision with reflection. The system sent out radio waves, silent pulses that traveled at the speed of light, bouncing off aircraft and returning as faint echoes. The time delay between transmission and return revealed distance. The direction of the antenna revealed bearing. With this simple but profound concept, war was no longer confined to daylight. American operators called it painting the sky. Each sweep of the glowing green line revealed shapes where none should be, ghostly blips that moved with purpose. Those dots meant bombers, torpedo planes, or reconnaissance flights, long before they came within human sight. Radar had stripped away the one weapon Japan had relied on most: invisibility. The advantage was staggering. Before radar, an air raid success depended on luck, the weather, visibility, timing. But now, U.S. commanders could coordinate defenses with machine precision. Fighter squadrons launched exactly when needed, conserving fuel and ammunition. Naval gunners no longer wasted fire on shadows. They had coordinates, speed, and altitude data in real time. For the first time in history, war had acquired foresight. Behind this technological triumph stood an army of minds, physicists, mathematicians, and engineers working across America's laboratories. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory became the nerve center of radar innovation. British and American collaboration brought in magnetron technology, shrinking radar sets from room-sized behemoths to compact, shipborne units. Every improvement tightened the web around the Pacific, until the Japanese could not take off without appearing somewhere on an American screen. The tactical angle. When surprise became predictable, Japan's strategy in the Pacific had always relied on surprise. The attack on Pearl Harbor, the raids on Darwin, the strikes across the Indian Ocean, all had depended on timing and stealth. But radar shattered that balance. Surprise itself had become predictable. By mid-1944, U.S. commanders in the Pacific, Admirals Raymond Spruance and Chester Nimitz, had learned to weave radar into every phase of operation. The Marianas campaign was the ultimate test. Radar stations on nearby islands detected Japanese bombers forming up hundreds of miles away. That information was instantly transmitted to Fleet Command, where operators plotted courses on translucent plotting boards. Pilots scrambled with uncanny precision, intercepting the enemy at exact points in the sky as if guided by prophecy. For the Japanese, it felt supernatural. The moment they broke formation or climbed to altitude, American fighters appeared, almost as though the enemy could read their thoughts. Pilots later recalled how American planes would dive from cloud cover at impossible moments, their approach too timed, too precise to be chance. Tactically, radar did more than prevent surprise. It created ambushes of its own. The U.S. Navy learned to use radar not just to detect, but to bait. Sometimes they allowed Japanese formations to approach within striking distance before unleashing counterattacks, guided entirely by radar tracking. What once had been Japan's signature tactic, the sudden raid, now belonged to the Americans. This inversion marked the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one ruled by information rather than instinct. The pilot's courage, though still vital, could no longer overcome an enemy that saw through clouds and darkness alike. The human angle, eyes against machines for the Japanese pilots. The war in the air was as much spiritual as physical. They were taught that true warriors trusted their senses, that a pilot's intuition could read the wind, smell the sea, and feel danger before seeing it. Many had been raised in an environment that honored the samurai's way of perception. the belief that the human spirit could outmatch the machine. So when radar began turning the tide, disbelief spread through the Air Corps. Some pilots refused to believe that the Americans had a device that could see beyond the horizon. They called it Yankee magic. Others thought the Americans were bluffing, using spotters or luck to time their defenses. But after a few missions, the evidence became undeniable. They began noticing the same pattern: interception before contact, ambush before engagement. Morale faltered. What did skill mean if the enemy already knew your position before takeoff? What did bravery mean if death awaited invisibly beyond the clouds? One veteran pilot later described the feeling. We were flying blind into eyes that never closed. It was not just a defeat of technology. It was a defeat of belief. Radar had stripped away the mystery that Japanese doctrine depended upon. It showed that faith and discipline could not survive untouched in the face of science. For young men raised to trust courage over circuits, that realization was shattering. Each echo on a radar screen was now more than a technical signal. It was the death of Japan's old way of war. And yet, on the other side of the ocean, American leaders understood that radar was only as powerful as the minds directing it. The leadership angle, commanding the invisible battlefield. In the Pacific, radar did not win battles alone. Leadership turned its signals into strategy. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the calm, deliberate commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, grasped what radar meant faster than almost anyone else. To him, it wasn't just a machine. It was foresight turned into command. Nimitz's genius was his ability to fuse intelligence, technology, and discipline into a single organism, a war machine that thought before it moved. Every carrier task force under his command was equipped with specialized radar ships and fighter direction centers. Inside those dimly lit rooms, officers tracked enemy blips and gave precise instructions to pilots via radio. Fighter direction officers learned to vector interceptors toward enemy formations at just the right angle and altitude, often minutes before visual contact. The result was a symphony of coordination: destroyers tracking, carriers relaying, pilots striking. Admiral Raymond Spruance, Nimitz's trusted tactician, described radar as the sixth sense of the fleet. He used it not only to defend but to anticipate, to read the flow of battle in real time. During the 1944 Marianas campaign, radar coverage allowed Spruance to predict Japanese air movements before the first scout planes even sighted them. He placed his ships precisely where they needed to be, not through instinct alone but through data. Cold, glowing, mathematical truth. The Japanese command, meanwhile, remained divided. Some officers urged rapid investment in radar countermeasures. Others clung to outdated doctrines of visual reconnaissance and human detection. Leadership paralysis set in. The Imperial Navy's top brass had been trained in a pre-radar world. Adapting to electronic warfare required not only equipment, but a new way of thinking. By the time they recognized that, radar had already redrawn the map of war. The Americans had not just built better weapons, they had built better awareness. The enemy perspective, denial, confusion, and shock inside Japanese command centers. Reports began to arrive that made no sense. Pilots swore they had launched undetected, yet American interceptors appeared over open ocean before the formation even cleared their own coastlines. Bombers reported being tracked through cloud cover, targeted in the dark, ambushed where radar should not have reached. At first, headquarters dismissed these claims as excuses for failure. The Imperial Japanese Navy had always prided itself on discipline. Blaming defeat on invisible forces sounded like superstition, but the pattern grew undeniable. Captured American documents and radio intercepts hinted at a vast detection network. Naval intelligence officers examined them in disbelief. Diagrams of radar stations on islands, reports of aircraft interception times accurate to the minute. "It is impossible," one officer noted in his diary. "They see us before we are born." By mid-1944, the Japanese High Command convened emergency meetings to assess how the Americans were achieving such precision. Engineers proposed that radio waves might be reflecting off aircraft. The concept was not new. Japan had experimented with similar technology, but their equipment lagged years behind. Wartime shortages of copper, vacuum tubes, and precision instruments crippled production. Factories were being bombed. Research labs relocated underground. Even when small radar units were deployed to Japanese bases, they suffered from weak transmitters and unreliable power sources. Meanwhile, American sets operated on higher frequencies with superior resolution and range. The Japanese equivalent of radar warfare was a flashlight against a searchlight. When word spread among pilots that the Americans could detect them before takeoff, disbelief turned into fear. For aviators trained to die honorably, it was not the threat of death that terrified them. It was the idea of helplessness. The sky had always been their domain. Now it felt like a trap they could not escape. The moral angle, the end of heroic warfare World War II, had begun as a contest of men and machines, but by 1944, it had become a contest of systems. Radar represented a moral shift as profound as its technical one. It turned warfare from confrontation into prediction. For centuries, soldiers faced each other on open fields, guided by courage, visibility, and chance. Now, decisions were made in darkness by unseen operators hundreds of miles from the front. For the Japanese warrior ethos, built on direct engagement and sacrifice, this was deeply unsettling. Radar stripped combat of its intimacy, transforming it into something impersonal, statistical, and relentless. There was no honor in being destroyed before the enemy could be seen. The sky that once symbolized freedom had become a cage mapped by invisible lines of energy. For the Americans, the morality was different. Radar saved lives. It reduced surprise, protected convoys, and prevented ambushes. Every blip detected early meant fewer ships sunk, fewer men killed. To the Allies, radar was the guardian angel of the fleet, the technological counterpart to courage. Yet even within American ranks, some wondered what kind of war this new power heralded. Victory had become mathematical, calculated through reflections and frequencies rather than valor and instinct. The humanity of battle was fading behind the glow of cathode ray tubes. Still, in the Pacific, there was no room for moral hesitation. Every innovation was a race for survival, and radar had given the U.S. a godlike advantage. The Japanese would soon experience its full effect, not as theory, but as reality in the skies above the Marianas, when an entire air armada was exposed before its engines even left the runway. The stage was set. The technology, the tactics, the fear, all converged toward a single moment when the illusion of Japanese surprise would die completely. June 19, 1944, the Marianas. At dawn, the air was perfectly still, the kind of silence that only exists before a storm. On the island of Guam, Japanese ground crews prepared the next wave of aircraft for launch. The orders were clear: attack the American fleet approaching from the east. Destroy the carriers before they could land troops on Saipan. It was meant to be a strike of vengeance, fast, overwhelming, decisive. Pilots climbed into their cockpits, tightening harnesses, adjusting goggles, whispering quiet prayers to the gods of wind and sky. They believed the enemy was far, still hours away. Their confidence rested on years of doctrine, that the Pacific's vastness protected them, that no one could know their movements before they were airborne. But hundreds of miles away, deep inside the combat information centers aboard USS Lexington, Enterprise, and Hornet, the Americans were already watching. Green radar screens glowed softly in the dim, red-lit rooms. Operators leaned close, tracing arcs with grease pencils. Contact, bearing 180, range 200 miles and multiple groups ascending. The voices were calm, almost clinical. The message was relayed through the fleet, encoded, repeated, confirmed. Within minutes, Admiral Raymond Spruance and Task Force 58 Commander Mark Mitcher knew exactly what was coming. The Japanese weren't ghosts in the dark anymore. They were coordinates, vectors, speeds. The invisible war had turned visible. On the Japanese airfields of Guam and Rota, the first wave began its takeoff run. Dust rose behind the tires as Zero fighters and Judy dive bombers clawed for altitude. The roar of engines filled the humid morning. But even before they cleared the coast, American radar on Saipan's captured beachheads tracked their every movement. From the carrier decks, Hellcat fighters began to launch, not in confusion, not in panic, but in a flawless rhythm of practiced precision, 30 seconds between takeoffs. Every pilot knew his vector. Every squadron had its altitude assigned. Above them, combat air patrols were already forming layers in the sky, a shield built not of chance but of mathematics. For the Japanese, the shock came swiftly. Barely 30 minutes into their climb, lookouts reported contrails glimmering far above, American interceptors diving like hawks out of the sun. "Impossible!" one pilot shouted over the radio.
They know.
"They know before we—" Static swallowed his words. What followed became known in American naval history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft fell into radar-guided ambushes. Hellcats ripped through bomber formations, guided from below by controllers reading blips on screens. Every maneuver, every turn was tracked and countered. Pilots on the ground had no warning. The Americans were waiting in perfect formation, as though they'd rehearsed the battle frame by frame. To the Japanese pilots, it felt like flying into prophecy. They had barely climbed above 5,000 feet when tracer fire stitched the horizon. Engines burst into flame before enemy silhouettes were even visible. Desperate voices filled the radio frequencies. Orders to brake, to climb, to dive, but the attackers were blind. Radar gave the Americans a kind of omniscience. They could see every move before it happened. In less than an hour, dozens of Japanese planes were gone, falling into the sea in burning spirals. American losses were minimal. Pilots returned to their carriers astonished at how precise the interceptions had been. They had not stumbled upon the enemy. They had been guided to him, as if the battle were being directed by an unseen hand. Inside the radar rooms, operators watched the fight unfold in abstract form, dots converging, scattering, disappearing. Each vanishing echo on the screen was a life extinguished somewhere over the Pacific. They knew the battle's outcome long before the gunfire ended. As the Japanese survivors limped back toward their islands, the truth began to sink in. This wasn't a coincidence. The Americans had known. They had been seen before they had even flown. On the ground, stunned pilots returned to shattered airstrips, faces streaked with sweat and disbelief. "How could they know?" one officer asked aloud. No one answered. The realization was too heavy, too final. The empire that once ruled the skies had just discovered that it was flying under the gaze of an invisible enemy. The Pacific sky, once a realm of glory and honor, had become a transparent cage. By midday on June 19, 1944, the sky above the Philippine Sea was a swirling storm of smoke, fire, and falling metal. The Japanese First Mobile Fleet had committed nearly 373 aircraft to the offensive. Fighters, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers launched from 4 carriers and multiple island bases. It was meant to be the decisive strike that would halt the American advance toward the Marianas. Instead, it became a massacre. Radar had given the Americans a window into every moment of the battle. As the first wave of Japanese planes was torn apart, radar operators aboard U.S. ships tracked new formations rising from Guam and Rota. Second group incoming, bearing 165. Range 100 miles. Orders rippled across the task force instantly. More Hellcats climbed to intercept. Each squadron was guided with mathematical precision by shipboard controllers. Blue Leader, turn 090. Bandits Angels 10, closing fast. The voices were calm, mechanical, men detached from the chaos outside. They could not see the explosions, but they heard the results in clipped transmissions. Splash 1. Splash 2. No shoots. On the Japanese side, chaos reigned. Their formations disintegrated under the first American intercepts. Without radar of their own, they were effectively blind. Pilots shouted bearings that meant nothing. The enemy could strike from any direction. Coordination collapsed as American fighters tore through the unescorted bombers. From the deck of the USS Lexington, observers watched the sky fill with black smoke and falling wreckage. Some pilots described the sight as almost unreal. Aircraft bursting into flame midair, trails of fire crossing like handwriting against the blue. The U.S. Navy's anti-aircraft gunners, equipped with radar-assisted fire control systems, joined the storm, firing into the sky with uncanny accuracy. Bombers were hit before they could dive, their payloads detonating in midair. By early afternoon, it was clear. Japan's last hope for air superiority had been annihilated. Out of the hundreds of planes launched, fewer than a third made it back to their carriers. Many that did were too damaged to ever fly again. The Americans had lost just a handful. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, Commanding the Japanese carrier fleet listened to the radio reports in silence. The news was devastating. Entire squadrons gone, airfield silent. Even before he could organize a second wave, radar aboard U.S. ships had already plotted every possible launch site. His force, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, was being hunted with mathematical precision. Radar coverage extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. On Saipan, ground-based SCR-270 sets tracked returning Japanese aircraft, vectoring Marine fighters to intercept survivors before they could land. Every direction they turned, eyes were upon them. When night came, the Americans' advantage only grew stronger. Radar-equipped ships and aircraft continued to monitor the skies. The Japanese pilots, exhausted and disoriented, tried to return to their carriers under cover of darkness, but their ships were already retreating. Some circled until their fuel ran out, disappearing into the black water below. On radar screens, the last of their signals flickered and vanished one by one. In the aftermath, Task Force 58's reports read like a cold ledger of annihilation. Enemy aircraft destroyed, 346 confirmed. Ours 29 lost. The numbers barely conveyed the scale of the disaster. Japan had not just lost a battle, it had lost its eyes, its faith, and its future in the air. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot marked the irreversible turning point of the Pacific Air War. Never again would Japan launch such a large-scale offensive from the skies, but what broke them more than numbers was realization. Intelligence later confirmed that American radar had detected their planes not after takeoff, but during their warm-up on the airstrips. Their signatures had been visible to long-range naval radar before the first propeller turned at full speed. The Americans had known every move before the Japanese had even lifted from the ground. For the pilots who survived, it was beyond comprehension. The sacred doctrine of surprise, the heart of Japanese aerial warfare, was gone. They had been outflown not by skill, but by science. Defeated not by bravery, but by invisible waves moving faster than thought. From that moment, Japanese commanders began referring to radar with reverence and fear. The unseen eye. Some called it the death of the warrior's age. On the American side, victory felt almost unreal. Pilots celebrated on carrier decks, but officers like Nimitz and Mitcher knew the truth. This was more than a triumph of arms. It was the moment technology had truly eclipsed tradition. The Pacific was now a realm of signals and echoes, not instincts and honor. The sun set red over the Philippine Sea that night, reflecting on the waves littered with oil and debris. For miles, the ocean burned with the remnants of an empire that had believed it could hide from sight. Radar had proven otherwise. The battle was over, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. In Tokyo, disbelief would give way to desperation as Japan raced to understand the invisible enemy that had stripped its pilots of surprise and pride alike. The morning after the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Pacific seemed quieter, almost surreal. The sky was no longer filled with the roar of Japanese engines or the distant thunder of anti-aircraft fire. Instead, the American fleet surveyed a battlefield littered with wreckage, flaming wings floating in the sea, twisted fuselages sinking beneath the waves, and a silence punctuated only by the calls of gulls. For Japan, the losses were catastrophic. Out of the hundreds of aircraft launched that morning, over 2/3 had been destroyed, along with dozens of experienced pilots who could not be replaced. The Imperial Navy's carrier air power, long the backbone of Japan's strategy, had been shattered. What had once been a force capable of rapid, coordinated strikes was now fragmented, diminished, and vulnerable. Intelligence reports captured later by U.S. forces revealed the depth of the Japanese confusion. Commanders in Tokyo initially refused to believe the accounts of radar-assisted interception. Many attributed the losses to chance, miscalculation, or pilot error. Only after interrogations and captured documents did the full picture emerge. The Americans had been able to detect Japanese planes before they even took off. Every formation, every climb, every approach vector had been visible to radar operators across the fleet and nearby islands. In response, Japan launched investigations and attempted rapid development of radar systems. The Type 2, Mark I Model 2 and other experimental long-range radar units were deployed on select bases and ships, but production was slow, hampered by material shortages and ongoing Allied bombing campaigns. The technology that had saved American lives could not be replicated in time to prevent further disasters. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was equally severe. Veterans of the early war who had relied on skill, daring, and instinct suddenly felt powerless. "We were always behind the eye that could not be closed," one pilot later wrote. Morale plummeted as airmen realized that no matter how precise their maneuvers, the enemy had foreknowledge of their every move. For a military culture that valued honor in aerial combat, this realization was devastating. Meanwhile, the Americans consolidated their technological advantage. Radar operators were trained to integrate readings with fighter direction and anti-aircraft coordination, creating a near-perfect defensive network. Pilots learned to trust instructions relayed from below, rather than relying solely on visual spotting. The result was a highly efficient system that preserved lives and maximized firepower. Statistically, the consequences were staggering. During the Marianas Campaign, U.S. forces destroyed over 350 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement, while suffering fewer than 30 losses themselves. Carrier air groups, once vulnerable to surprise attacks, now operated with unprecedented protection. American dominance in the air translated directly to naval superiority, allowing for the continued island-hopping campaign with minimal interruption. The battle also exposed flaws in Japanese intelligence and strategic planning. Overconfidence in surprise attacks had left their forces exposed, while underestimating technological innovation left them blind. Japan's failure to anticipate. Radar's effectiveness demonstrated a fundamental gap. They had prepared for the tactics of the past but were unready for the tools of the future. The destruction of Japan's carrier aviation during this period marked a turning point in the Pacific theater. The loss of trained pilots and aircraft made subsequent Japanese operations increasingly defensive and reactive. Instead of taking the initiative, Japan was forced into a game of attrition, always responding to an enemy that had already seen its moves. Radar had not only saved American lives and ships, it had altered the strategic calculus of the war. By denying Japan the ability to achieve surprise, it effectively neutralized the main advantage the Japanese air forces had relied upon since 1941. The invisible network of radar stations, plotting boards, and fighter controllers had become as lethal as any battleship or aircraft. As the American fleet moved on, securing the Marianas and preparing for Saipan's capture, the Japanese military grappled with both tangible and intangible losses. Material destruction, pilot deaths, and shattered morale converged to create a vacuum in their operational capability. The consequences would ripple through every engagement that followed, shaping the remainder of the Pacific campaign. The sea bore the silent testimony of this transformation. Wreckage floated where confidence and tactics had once soared. A new kind of warfare had arrived, one where foresight, technology, and coordination eclipsed courage, skill, and surprise. In the weeks following the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the ramifications of radar's decisive role became painfully clear to the Japanese military. Operational planning, once based on the assumption of surprise, had to be rewritten. Entire doctrines of attack and interception, the foundation of Japanese naval aviation, were rendered obsolete almost overnight. Carrier-based air operations, which had previously been Japan's most potent weapon, now carried the constant threat of preemptive counteraction. Japanese reports noted the devastating efficiency of American radar coordination. Pilots flying from Guam and Saipan discovered that no matter how carefully they staged their formations, American fighters were already vectoring toward them in perfect position. Even the most skilled aces were caught off guard, their years of combat experience rendered insufficient against an enemy that had foreknowledge of their every move. Senior officers acknowledged in post-action analyses that the Americans had effectively created a system that allowed them to fight a battle before the first Japanese engine even started. Attempts to develop countermeasures proved limited. The Japanese deployed experimental radar detection devices on a handful of aircraft and bases, but the technology was immature. Equipment was often bulky, unreliable, and in insufficient quantity to cover the entire theater. Meanwhile, U.S. radar systems continued to improve, incorporating advanced signal processing and better coordination between ships, carriers, and ground stations. Strategically, the impact on the Pacific campaign was profound. The Americans' ability to detect and intercept Japanese airstrikes before they could launch shifted the balance of power decisively. Japanese carriers, once the centerpiece of naval projection, became vulnerable. Japan's options narrowed. Defensive operations replaced offensive strategy, and the initiative in the air passed entirely to the Allies. The once vaunted Japanese doctrine of preemptive strike had been neutralized, leaving the empire increasingly reactive. Casualty reports underscored the scale of this transformation. Over the course of the Marianas Campaign, hundreds of Japanese aircraft were destroyed, and dozens of experienced pilots killed or captured. By contrast, American losses were minimal, a fraction of those inflicted on their adversary. This disparity in human and material resources accelerated Japan's decline in aerial capabilities. Young pilots could not be trained quickly enough to replace the veterans lost, and aircraft production could not keep pace with attrition. The psychological toll on Japanese forces was as significant as the material losses. Pilots returned to their airfields in shock, having seen entire formations annihilated before they could mount meaningful attacks. Officers and strategists alike began to refer to radar as the unseen eye, a force that defied traditional notions of combat skill and honor. Confidence in Japanese air doctrine eroded, creating hesitation and uncertainty in planning subsequent operations. For the Americans, radar proved to be a force multiplier beyond simple detection. It allowed for coordinated fighter interceptions, improved anti-aircraft accuracy, and optimized fleet positioning. Carrier task forces could operate more aggressively, knowing that early warning systems would detect threats long before they could reach effective range. The Pacific theater had entered a new era. Battles would no longer rely solely on bravery or tactics, but on the integration of intelligence, technology, and command. The broader implications extended beyond the Marianas. Radar became a cornerstone of U.S. strategy in every subsequent Pacific operation, from Leyte Gulf to Okinawa. Japanese forces, forced to adapt late in the war, found themselves constantly responding to an invisible network that they could neither match nor fully comprehend. By the time Japan deployed limited radar assets, the technological and tactical gap was insurmountable. In retrospect, historians view the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot not just as a single aerial battle, but as a symbolic shift in warfare. It marked the point at which technological foresight overtook traditional combat experience in the Pacific. The invisible eyes of radar transformed how battles were fought, measured, and won. The psychological, tactical, and material consequences of this moment echoed through the remainder of the war, accelerating Japan's decline while securing Allied dominance in the Pacific skies. The ocean, once a theater for daring attacks and heroism, had become a canvas of invisible warfare. The waves bore silent testimony to the power of observation over instinct, technology over tradition, and foresight over surprise. From that day forward, the Japanese pilot who once believed the sky was his domain now flew under the gaze of the unseen, and the Pacific was no longer theirs to command. The events over the Marianas in June 1944 marked more than a single battle. They marked a transformation in the very nature of warfare. For centuries, air combat had been a contest of skill, courage, and instinct. Pilots relied on their eyes, their training, and their judgment. Surprise was the weapon of the bold, and victory often belonged to those who could act first. Radar changed all of that. It rendered the invisible visible. It turned intuition into data, instinct into calculation. Where once a pilot could soar unseen, now operators hundreds of miles away could track every takeoff, every climb, every turn. The Japanese pilots who had trained to trust in stealth and skill discovered, to their shock, that they were being watched before their engines even roared. Yet the story is not simply one of machines triumphing over men. It is a story of human ingenuity, of scientists, engineers, and leaders who envisioned a new kind of battlefield and brought it into reality. The Americans did not merely rely on courage, they combined foresight with technology, turning what was once impossible into certainty. The synergy between human decision and electronic precision reshaped strategy, tactics, and morale alike. For the Japanese, the lesson was harsh and enduring. Pride, discipline, and tradition could not overcome the unseen. Entire doctrines were upended, and the psychological cost weighed heavily on pilots and commanders. The unseen eye became both a literal and symbolic force. a reminder that technological innovation can alter the very rules of combat. The Pacific skies had become a new world, one where survival depended not on who could fly fastest or strike hardest, but on who could see and think first. Radar did more than save lives or sink planes. It changed the way wars were fought, turning invisibility into vulnerability and signaling the dawn of electronic warfare. In the end, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot reminds us that history often pivots on what cannot be seen. Battles are won as much by vision, literal and figurative, as by valor. The legacy of those invisible waves continues, echoing through modern warfare, where detection, intelligence, and foresight often decide the fate of nations long before the first shot is fired.